Welcome to This Explainer. Political interviews can often feel like a dizzying barrage of talking points, right? But what happens when you step back and actually look at the underlying strategy? Well, today we're unpacking a recent Sky News interview with One Nation leader Pauline Hanson. And just to be clear, we aren't taking sides here. Instead, we're using her own words as a blueprint to map out exactly how a modern populist pitch is constructed and why these kinds of rhetorical strategies work so effectively on a psychological level. Okay, let's dive right into this by starting with her core thesis. Right out of the gate, Hanson targets the absolute biggest existential threat to any third-party politician, and that is the fear that voting for them is simply throwing your vote away. By declaring a vote for One Nation is not a wasted vote, she's actively trying to dismantle that psychological hurdle of party loyalty. She's framing her party not as some fringe protest, but as a viable, practical alternative. Literally everything else she builds in this interview rests on that one foundation. To make sense of her wide-ranging interview, we've broken the anatomy of her pitch down into 5 key themes. First, her anti-establishment electoral strategy. Second, critiquing labor's economic budget. Third, the generational housing crisis. Fourth, blaming migration and net zero. And fifth, her claim that the coalition is adopting One Nation policies. All right, jumping into Section 1, anti-establishment electoral strategy. Hanson frames her party as the voice of the people against disconnected elites, which, as you probably know, is a classic populist framing. To prove this, she anchors her argument on a very specific data point, the 40% vote share her party secured in a recent by-election. And to make this number hit even harder, she makes sure to note that this electorate had actually been a safe coalition seat for 77 years. By highlighting this massive historical shift, she gives voters a tangible data point to back up her claim that Australians are eagerly looking for alternatives. For Hanson, this massive shift isn't just a statistic. It's absolute proof that voters are demanding accountability. Notice the rhetoric she uses here. She says voters are crying out to not be forgotten, telling the major parties, hey, you work for us. It's a highly effective strategic move to position herself not just as a critic on the sidelines, but as the direct messenger for frustrated and forgotten voters. Moving on to Section 2, critiquing labor's economic budget. Hanson really doesn't mince words when it comes to the current Labor government's budget. She characterizes it as communism that punishes hard workers. The linchpin of her attack here is the widely publicized $250 tax relief measure. But instead of debating the overarching economic merits of the policy, she goes straight for the framing of the number itself. This is a brilliant showcase of rhetorical math. It's essentially price anchoring in reverse. By breaking an impressive-sounding $250 annual lump sum down to just $5 a week, she instantly shrinks its perceived value. I mean, $5. She frames it as an insulting scam and a cunning political trap, basically asserting the government is giving out peanuts just so they can run attack ads against anyone who votes against it later on. To further dismantle the appeal of that relief, her narrative pivots to massive tax grabs. She points out that the government is simultaneously extracting an additional $15 billion in personal tax and $13 billion from superannuation. So the core narrative she's pushing? The establishment is tossing you a $5 coin with one hand while quietly sweeping billions off the table with the other to cover their uncontrolled spending. Now for Section 3, the generational housing crisis. This brings us to a highly emotional issue for so many voters right now, housing affordability. Hanson attempts a really tricky balancing act here, trying to build a bridge between older and younger generations. First, she defends her own baby boomer generation, pointing out their hard work and lack of modern luxuries back in the day. But then she validates the extreme financial struggle of today's youth by contrasting the past and the present. When a house used to cost 3 times your age and now costs 15 to 16 times your age, well, acknowledging that massive gap allows her to tap right into young voter frustration. So what about the current government's solutions? Well, in her view, interventions like the 5% deposit scheme are actually toxic. Pushing young people to buy homes with barely any equity right as interest rates are rising is to her a recipe for severe mortgage stress. She frames it not as a helping hand from the government, but as a debt trap that keeps everyday people struggling just to keep their heads above water. Which leads us to Section 4, blaming migration and net zero. Having established the intense pain of the housing and cost of living crises, The pitch now pivots to supplying a cause. Hanson explicitly targets mass migration as an artificial tool used by the government to prop up GDP, which she argues is choking the housing supply. On top of that, she points to net zero environmental policies as the direct culprit for skyrocketing household electricity costs. She even advocates for scrapping the net zero department entirely to stop, as she puts it, wealth from flowing overseas. To anchor these broad claims, she relies on some pretty stark economic casualties. She cites 50,000 small businesses going insolvent and over 1,400 manufacturing operations shuttering under the current government. By tying these specific closures directly back to migration and climate policies, she constructs a narrative of a government that is fundamentally mismanaging the economy to the total detriment of the working class. Finally, we hit Section 5. Coalition adopts one nation policies. This brings us to her ultimate claim of vindication. She asserts that the mainstream opposition is quietly adopting her long-held platform. She notes that coalition figure Angus Taylor is proposing measures like a 130,000 net migration cap, tying migration directly to new housing builds, and imposing an 8-year wait for citizenship. She views this as proof that her populist ideas have literally forced the establishment's hand. The implication is crystal clear. They are only adopting these policies now because they realize they're failing the public. She closes this strategic pitch by drawing a very distinct political battle line. Reaching out to the coalition, she urges them to view her not as an enemy, but as an ally against what she calls the true enemies destroying the country. And who are they? Labor, the Greens, and the Teal Independents, a group of affluent, climate-focused independents who have recently disrupted traditional conservative strongholds. It's a strategic call to unify the conservative vote, but strictly on her populist terms. Ultimately, unpacking this interview reveals a fascinating dynamic about the future of our political landscape. Hanson's entire pitch rests on the idea that the establishment has broken the public's trust, and she views the opposition's pivot to her policies as the ultimate proof that she was right all along. But it leaves us with a really critical strategic question. If major establishment parties absorb populist policies and make them mainstream, does the original populist party finally win the voters' ultimate trust? Or do voters simply stick to the safer, more familiar establishment brand they already know? It's a high-stakes strategic tightrope. Keep asking questions about the rhetoric you hear every day, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.